Greetings and welcome to Raven's Roost Forge. I'm your host Tate, and today we're going to learn how to case harden a stump anvil. Let's get started. This first little bit of footage actually was shown in the last video, but I wanted to recap. Basically, if you're going to do a case hardening on something, you need to make sure that is already prepped and to dimension, because you don't want to have to do any grinding, or at least very little grinding. Otherwise, you're just going to grind through the case. It's only going to be about a millimeter or two at most. Now that I'm happy with the grind and polish on this, we can start the case hardening process. There are some commercial available products like Caseonite, but they're hard to get, they're expensive, and they have some harsh chemicals in them that we don't need to use. The homemade compound that I use just has about 20% sodium carbonate, and the rest is crushed charcoal. We'll use regular white flour as the binder. I use a ratio of about 2-to-1 compound to flour, but it's not critical because the flour is mostly carbon as well. I mix the compound and flour before adding water, then add just enough water to form a dry paste and mix thoroughly. What you end up with is a bit like Play-Doh. My camera died without me realizing it, so I lost the footage of actually placing the compound. But you just want to put it over the top like a layer of clay. Lay it on about 1/4 to 1/2 inch thick. It looked a little like a bad wig, so you can see I drew a face on there. But anyway, I let it dry for a few hours, and then I put it in an oven at low heat to drive off the last of the moisture. Now that the compound is completely hard and dry, it's time to coat it with some clay. The clay will form a hard protective coating that will trap the carbon monoxide inside as the charcoal burns. It's the carbon monoxide that actually penetrates the metal and produces the case. I already happen to have some terracotta clay from another project, and so that's what I'm going to use to coat the outside. It's pretty dry, so I need to moisten it and then massage it in order to soften it up. Once your clay is nice and pliable, you want to use it to form a cap over the compound. Make sure that it completely seals the compound in. So you want the clay to go all the way down to the metal. Once it's all done, you want to let it dry for a while, and then you can put it in an oven at low heat to dry off any remaining moisture. It's actually much better to let it dry completely without using the oven. You're going to get less cracking that way, but I was just in too much of a hurry. So you can see I got a lot of bad cracking, so I'm going to patch that up with some extra clay and then allow that to dry. Now, it would have cracked less if I let it dry without using the oven. And I also forgot to add any grog to the clay. Adding about 20% sand to the clay before I put it on would have made it crack much less. So here you can see after everything's all dried up, there's still just a little bit of very small kind of micro cracking, but that's just on the surface. As long as you have a fairly good seal, it should work good enough. So we're just about ready to actually do the case hardening procedure. I'm just going to wrap it in some stainless steel lock wire in order to help hold the clay layer on there as we fire it. So now we've got that clay layer bound on there with the stainless steel wire nice and tight. Hopefully it won't be able to crack and break away in the fire. In order to form a hard case on the outside of a piece of steel using this method, you need to be able to get the carbon to penetrate into the steel. This is only going to happen at austenitizing temperatures, which is about 1450 degrees Fahrenheit roughly. Before we can start a fire in order to heat that steel up to the proper temperature, we got to clean out the old charcoal and ash from the last fire. Make sure you take the time to ensure that there's nothing blocking the grates so that you get good airflow. Just as in the previous video, we're going to use a balled up piece of the charcoal bag in order to start our fire. Turn the crank for a little bit in order to make sure that the fire is really going. And then we're going to add the charcoal that we just pulled out from the previous fire. Maybe using the charcoal bag is not such a good idea. When it burns, it seems to give off a lot of gross yellow smoke. But once you add a little air, it starts to burn much more cleanly. Once you have a base of hot coals, you can add the anvil into the forge. You don't want to push it too deep down into the fire pot. You want to make sure that you've got a nice bed of coals underneath it. And then you want to push up coals next to it and then add some fresh charcoal on top. Once you have a nice big pile of charcoal, you want to crank it until you get a nice hot fire. The case hardening process is both time and temperature dependent, so once you get the anvil up to temperature, you need to allow it to soak in the heat for between 20 minutes and an hour in order to absorb the carbon. This should give you roughly a 1 millimeter thick case. The longer you soak at temperature, the deeper the case will become, but recall there's only about 3/8 of an inch of carbon compound surrounding that anvil, so we need to remove it before we burn through it, otherwise we could ruin the whole process. So I let it soak at temperature for about 30 minutes. Basically all I did was come out every few minutes and stoke the fire and then make sure that there was enough charcoal. You also need to periodically pull the anvil out of the coals and then push coals below it, because as the coals burn down, the anvil is going to end up going lower and lower in the fire, and you want to make sure that there are plenty of coals underneath it. Once the anvil has soaked for long enough, you want to pull it out, quickly break off the clay covering, and then quench it in warm water. Make sure you agitate thoroughly when you're quenching in order to cool it as quickly as possible. Don't remove the anvil until it's cool. I thought it was kind of interesting that you could see the last little bit of charcoal burning away in the clay cap as I'm quenching. It's still a little too warm to hold without gloves, but as long as it's below about 300 degrees Fahrenheit, the transformation should be complete. And here's what it looks like after coming out of the quench. And here's what's left of the clay cap. There's still just a little bit of charcoal in there, so we know we didn't burn through it all. Here's those little bits of charcoal that fell out. Anyway, the next step is to polish the surface down to bare metal so that we can hardness test it. It's important that we get down to nice clean metal in order to do the hardness test, but we don't want to grind too deep because the case is not very thick. So all I'm doing here is using a surface conditioning disc on a little air die grinder in order to clean down to the bare metal. And then I'm going to use my hardness testing files to see what kind of a surface hardness we got. The proper way to use hardness files is always to start with the hardest file and then work your way down until you're not able to scratch the material anymore. But I find this usually leaves a lot of deep scratches, so I tend to try to start with a file that's a little closer to what I think the hardness actually is, and then work from there. In the case of this anvil, I was able to scratch the surface with the 60 and then just barely with the 55, so it's probably around 55 HRC. I didn't perform a tempering cycle because I'm happy with the 55 HRC hardness. And also, you don't always need to temper case hardened material because the soft steel at the core actually makes the hardened surface much less brittle. And you can see that we actually get some decent little rebound off of this anvil. But the main reason I was doing this test was to see if the ball bearing dented the surface. A soft steel surface would actually be dented by the ball bearing, whereas the case hardened surface was not marred at all. So now this anvil is ready for use. I hope you enjoyed the video and you learned something. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and happy forging!